About 9 o'clock on May 3rd, we boarded the train for Yangtan. On this leg of the trip, 2 white women missionaries gave us canned milk to drink. I have often wondered where they came from and where they went. At Yangtan, we boarded a charcoal-burning bus and chugged our way into Hengyang, arriving there on May 6th. Again, we were taken to the local Chinese Air Force station and put up at their hostel in the care of John T. Yang, a pleasant-mannered man who also spoke a little English. After fidgeting at this base for over a week, we were notified that we would soon be flown to Chungking. On May 14th, a DC-3 piloted by an American crew dropped in on the dirt strip and picked us up. We wanted to take Liu with us, but Army regulations forbade it. I had a lump in my throat as we shook hands with him and left him standing there on the dusty airstrip. He had risked his neck for us and had seen to it that we had the best of care. We all vowed that we would help him if we could, and in our official reports we recommended he be employed in some way by the AVG or the American forces in China. Although our hearts ached for him, we all felt it would be the last we would ever see or hear of him. Little did we know that he would later come to America, become a citizen, and realize his dream of working for the Air Force. Our arrival in Chungking that day was a day of rejoicing for us. We were the 3rd group to get in, and that night, gracious Madame Chiang Kai-shek put on her 3rd party for our group. We had a sumptuous banquet, and she presented each of us with the Chinese Army, Navy, and Air Force medal. After our experiences of the previous month, we were glad we had finally arrived at our original destination. For us as a crew, this mission was finally over. For most of us, however, it was just the first of many combat missions to follow. I was eating breakfast when the call to General Quarters was sounded. When the call came, "Army crews, man your planes," I rushed to my cabin. I was one of the 12 men who slept in the captain's quarters and hurriedly packed my B4 bag. Besides my clothes, shaving kit and such, I stuffed in 4 boxes of Robert Burns cigars and 2 boxes of Baby Ruth candy bars. My phonograph and records would give us some American jazz in China, so I decided to take it along. My records were in a cake tin, and I asked Bob Clever to put them in his plane. Now that we were going, I felt that the long hours of preparation were finally coming to an end. I had the fullest confidence in the B-25, and that we would make it off the deck safely. Bob Gray wheeled Whiskey Pete, named after his Pinto back in Texas, into position, and we took off. After we got off and were level, we were constantly on the watch for enemy vessels and aircraft because we were sure that the task force had been detected. We did spot one vessel about 15 minutes after takeoff, but since they did not fire on us, we kept right on course. After we had settled down, Bob Gray turned to me with a grin and asked, "What are you doing up here?" I told him the same thing he was, getting ready for the ordeal ahead. Although the cockpit was filled with fumes from the bladder tank lying on top of the bomb bay, we broke open a box of Robert Burns and smoked them all the way in to the enemy mainland. The sight of the enemy coast was sort of awe-inspiring, as it was the first land we had seen in 5 hours. We were happy to see it, but we knew the people there would not be happy to see us. It was a bright and sunny day, and I thought to myself that this was one country that looked exactly like I had pictured in my mind it would look. We tried to home in with our radio compass on enemy commercial radio stations. We thought we would know when the boss dropped his explosives, as the enemy would shut down their radio stations and our homing needle would stop pointing. As it was, the enemy never turned off the station we were tuned in on, and we were tracking outbound on their station to China 2 hours after we dropped our explosives. We figured that since we were the 3rd ship in and that we were strung out 5 or 6 minutes apart, their fighters would be alerted and that their ACAC would be waiting to pick us off, one by one. Our target was in the Tokyo area on the east side of town, on the banks of a river. We had 3 500-pound HE bombs and 1 500-pound thermite cluster firebomb. We dropped our explosives from 900 feet. The 3 explosive bombs were dumped on industrial-type targets and the thermite cluster on the dock area. Anti-aircraft fire was light to moderate. It had the correct altitude, but not our speed. We made an exceptionally slow bomb run, attempting to save fuel. Before reaching the target, Bob Gray took a vote among the crew that if we were badly damaged by gunfire, what we wanted to do. All the members of the crew, with the exception of Gray, stated that if we had the chance, we would like to bail out. Bob said that if he had the chance, he would let us out. Then he was going to pick out the biggest building in Tokyo and stick Whiskey Pete right in the middle of it. As we dropped our last explosive, we were jumped by enemy fighters. Just prior to this, our gun turret went out of commission and we had to switch to the alternate source of power in order to get it operational. We had to increase our power settings in order to outrun these fighters. Sergeant Aidan Jones, the bombardier, was strafing with the .30 caliber nose gun and the top turret was being fired by Corporal Factor at the fighters. We suffered no damage and outran them. As we passed through Tokyo Bay, we could see the fires started by the bombs from the other crews ahead of us and noticed the barrage balloons up in the city of Tokyo. We passed by the Emperor's Palace and could easily have bombed it if we had wanted to. Several destroyers and cruisers in the harbour were firing at us and had gotten underway. It looked like they were attempting to pick up our course heading so they could radio it on ahead. We picked up a heading of due south, hoping that they would think we were headed for the Philippines. We finally turned back, after about 15 minutes, to our heading to China. It was about this time that the good Lord started giving us a hand. We had bucked a 15-knot headwind from the carrier to the target. As we left the target area, the wind shifted and gave us a tailwind all the way into China. This is contrary to the winds in that country, as they should have been blowing on our nose, from west to east. If we had not received this tailwind for about 7 hours, we figured we would have landed about 200 miles out in the China Sea, out of fuel. The only friendly aircraft we saw after leaving the target area was another B-25 about 1 hour before dusk. He was on a track of about 45 degrees different from ours. When I noticed this, I turned to our navigator, Lieutenant Ozuk, and said, "Ozuk, one of you two navigators is wrong. Who is it, you or him?" Ozuk replied confidently, "It is not me. Turn 2 more degrees off of his course." It sure was a temptation to turn and follow the other aircraft, so that at least 2 crews could have been together. I later found out that this was one of the 2 crews that was captured by the enemy. Just after this, we ran into weather and proceeded on instruments from there on. If we had not gotten the tailwind that I mentioned, we had planned on ditching the plane in the China Sea, getting into the life raft and attempting to float to the China coast. After we went on instruments, we knew that we would not be intercepted by fighters, so we decided to lighten the aircraft by throwing everything overboard that we could spare. We dumped half the ammunition that we had left in the guns and anything else that was not tied down. Several times after dark, we saw either fishing boats or people on islands blinking lights at us as if they were attempting to extract some signal from us. We flipped our landing lights on and off several times, hoping to give the proper signal if they were enemy. We saw one large city all lit up through the overcast, but could not determine where we were. Since a ground station was supposed to have been established for us to contact on 4,495 kilocycles, we called them for about an hour, but to no avail. We dropped 2 flares about an hour after we figured we had crossed the coast of China, hoping to see some flat land to land on, but no luck. We were still flying in a thin overcast when, about 10 o'clock, with both tanks registering empty, we knew that we would have to bail out. Gray turned the plane due south and gave us the order to go. Sergeant Jones pulled the front hatch release and kicked the door out. I then called to Factor in the rear to get his hatch off and bail out. I sent Jones out first, and Lieutenant Ozuk after him. I flashed my light in the rear of the plane to see if Factor had gone saw no one and got no answer to my yell. I grabbed a box of Robert Burns cigars and a bunch of Baby Ruths and stuffed as many as I could inside my A2 jacket. Then I bundled up my private arsenal, a 44-40 Winchester rifle, German Luger, 2.45 automatics, and .22 automatic and an axe and a Bowie knife, and got ready to go. I told Bob Gray that I would be walking west and that I would see him in Chungking. I wished him luck and dropped through the escape hatch. Bob had dropped the gear and flaps, slowing the plane to 140 miles per hour in order to give us a chance to bail out. As I went out, I watched the 2 exhaust stacks go over my head, then reached for the D-ring on my chute but could not find it. Scrambling frantically, I finally found it dangling at my side and pulled. I was aware of the weirdest sound as I continued to fall. It was the rubber bands which held the shroud lines in my parachute pack twinging as they let go each bunch of lines. Since I only had a 24-foot chute which was too small for my weight, the opening shock was something I was not ready for. I saw red and the impact jerked my Bowie knife, axe, canteen and all my guns away, except the one in my holster. The box of cigars disappeared out of my jacket, and the Baby Ruths were shucked, leaving nothing but the wrappers. Coming down, I thought I heard waves breaking on a beach, and the horrible thought came to me that I had sent the rest of the crew out without their Mae West life vests on. They would surely drown if we were over the ocean and not over land as we figured. Just as I struggled to release my leg straps to get away from the chute in case I landed in the water, I hit the ground with a thud. What I thought was waves slapping on a beach was wind blowing through pine trees. After I hit the ground, I started to wander around, but then thought better of it because I might fall off a cliff or into a ravine during my wanderings. Groping around, I found a fairly flat spot and rolled up in my parachute to attempt to keep dry and warm. It had begun to rain heavily and I was cold. The next morning dawned bright and cheerful. I saw that I was in the mountains and had landed close to the top of one. If I had wandered around like I had started to do the night before, I probably would have lost my life or at least broken a leg. I searched a while for my canteen and guns and other equipment but never found them. Knowing that I would have to have water sooner or later, I cut the back of my parachute open, pulled out the sponge rubber cushion and attempted to make a water bag out of it. While cutting holes in it so that I could carry it on my back as a water bag, the pocket knife slipped and I cut my left index finger badly. I got some water from a running stream and started down a little mountain trail. I had intended to walk the top of the mountains as we had been informed that there was only one railroad in that part of China and that if we could find it, it would take us into our destination. As I started down the trail, I ran into a Chinese man and woman who took one terrified look at me and took off running. I did not see another soul until much later that day when I came upon an old Chinese woman gathering firewood. The sight of me threw her into a panic and she threw her sticks down and hobbled off on her wrapped feet. I wandered on for the rest of the day and that night slept on top of the 7th mountain I had crossed. My shoes were badly torn. It was still raining with a very stiff wind. On the 3rd day, with nothing to eat, I became entangled in a thicket. My hands, legs and face were badly scratched and bleeding, and I was dead tired. I just sat down in a creek, with water up to my waist, resting and trying to make up my mind what to do. About this time, the brush parted and a Chinese with a big smile on his face stuck out his hand to help me get out of the creek. Several more Chinese then came out of the brush and helped push and carry me up to a little trail on the mountainside. They were armed with old 17th century flintlock muskets. They evidently had never seen rubber before, as they were very interested in the sponge rubber cushion from the back of my parachute. I had cut pieces of it to put under the heels of my shoes. They played with this rubber, felt it and bounced it around on the ground like a bunch of kids. I was so tired about this time that I could not walk over 100 yards without rest. One of the Chinese, about 5'4", offered to carry me on his back. I laughed at him because I thought I would be too heavy for him. He insisted that I get on his back, and when I did, he threw it into high blower and went up and down those hills for 2 miles like a billy goat and like I was not even on his back. As we approached his village at dark, I became embarrassed because he was carrying me, a supposedly great aviator. I tapped him on the head several times, indicating to let me off and that I could walk. I said to myself, I am going to walk into this village if it takes me all night. I won't come in with this little 5'4" Chinese man carrying me. I spent the night in that village, and the next morning, my benefactors made signs and noises like airplanes hitting a mountain. I set out with them due south and then east, and felt sure they were leading me the wrong way. We met some Chinese guerrillas about noon who were carrying parts of our plane. They led me to a village where I found pieces of baggage, clothes and navigation equipment. They were from our ship. They then led me to the wreckage and I found it had been stripped. Heading east again, they took me to a village where I found the body of Corporal Factor, our engineer gunner. 2 Chinese soldiers gave me a note saying that Bob Gray and Sergeant Jones were 1 day ahead of me and had slept there the night before. There was nothing I could do for Factor, so I spent that night in the guerrilla headquarters. The next morning we started out to catch up with the other 2 and reached them about 4 p.m. The 3 of us set out in a small boat down the river for Chuchou. Made 12 miles that afternoon but had to stop at dark because of bad rapids. Kept going for Chuchou the next morning at 6 a.m. and rode for 14 hours, reaching our destination at 8 p.m. We were well received at Chuchou and stayed there 2 days where we got food, shelter and medical attention. We experienced air raids both days. 20 of us then set out for Kuilin but instead went to Hengyang after a 3-day trip by train and bus. We were then taken to Chungking by C-47. Takeoff was at 8:30, approximately 15 minutes after the preceding ship had taken off, due to the difficulty in starting my right engine. No difficulty was experienced in the takeoff. Full flaps and 10 degrees stabilizer was used. We circled the ship once to try and compensate our compass as we felt the island on the carrier had pulled it off. We flew close to the water to avoid detection and cruised according to the fuel consumption chart we had. My gunner, Corporal Bert Jordan, kept trying to tell me something over the interphone, but I could not understand him. We flew at about 75 feet over the water to avoid detection. Approximately at 9 o'clock, we saw a large freighter on our right. It made a sharp turn away from us, which we did not understand because I did not believe they could see our airplane insignia. After our crawlway tank was empty, Jordan came forward and gave us the unwelcome news that our rear turret was out of commission, leaving our 50 caliber guns useless. He also informed us that our left wing tank was leaking gas. From then on, I did not fill the tank completely full when I transferred gas, and most of the leakage stopped as it came from around the cap. However, at the rate it was going out, we must have lost considerable gas. I told the navigator, Lieutenant Harry McCool, to attempt to make a land fall just south of Tokyo, going under the assumption that the 3 planes ahead of me would make their land fall directly east of Tokyo and bring interceptor airplanes out in that direction, and I could slip by them. We made our land fall south of Tokyo on a small group of islands at approximately 12:30. We were still flying at 75 feet. The weather had been broken clouds at 2,000 feet, going to clear as we neared the enemy territory. Lucian Youngblood, my co-pilot, went back to transfer the last bit of gas from the bomb bay to the wing tanks, which did not quite fill the wing tanks up. He was still back there when I saw 2 pursuits coming at us, and I immediately turned under them. One fired, and I saw tracer bullets going over the pilot's compartment. I yelled to Youngblood to come back to his seat. The co-pilot then pointed out 2 more fighters going across our bow at about 1,500 feet, and they looked as if they were ready to peel off on us. I told the navigator to tell Corporal Bob Stevens in the nose to try and use his nose guns. I had given him previous instructions to have the bombardier salvo the bombs if we were intercepted by pursuit, so the bombs were salvoed from about 75 feet. By this time we were indicating about 270 miles per hour, and I had turned under the 2 pursuits that had come across our bow and then turned due south. These pursuits all had non-retractable landing gear, and I presumed them to be of the 97 type. McCool had come back to his compartment and said that he had seen several pursuits that looked like British Spitfires, and by looking back through the navigator's side window, I saw one of these planes on our right rear completing a firing pass. It had an inline engine, retractable gear, and double-tapered wings. I had no idea what type this was, but supposed it was a Zero with an inline engine. After running for about 10 minutes, nobody could see another airplane, so I turned and headed down the coast of the enemy territory towards China. We passed under 2 patrols of airplanes going down the coast about 1 hour and 30 minutes from the southern tip of the enemy territory. They were heading in a generally northerly direction and flying at about 3,000 feet. Approximately 15 minutes separated each pair, so they were about 40 miles apart. Apparently, none of them saw us since they never changed course. After crossing the southern tip of the enemy territory, our right engine began to load up and cough. We corrected this by increasing the revolutions per minute every 20 or 30 minutes, but later on this did not work, and we had to run that engine in automatic rich. This, I believe, was due to faulty carburation at low revolutions per minute. At about 150 miles from the China coast, the weather got steadily worse, and at about 100 miles from the coast, it began to rain heavily, with the clouds going right down to the water. This, combined with the darkness, made it very difficult to keep contact with the water. However, we kept contact until we began seeing the small islands off the Chinese coast, and then we went on instruments and climbed up into the clouds. This was approximately at 9:50 p.m. We leveled out at 6,000 feet, and after flying for 20 minutes, I realized we could not land and had everybody get ready to bail out as we were almost out of gas. We bailed out in the following order: the gunner, the bombardier, the navigator, then the co-pilot and myself. This was about 10:30 p.m. I landed on the side of a mountain and remained where I had fallen until the next morning. In the morning I started looking for my crew, but as no one answered to my shouts and I had lost my gun in bailing out, I could not fire a shot. I gave this up around noon. I walked all that day along the mountain ridge and around 4 in the afternoon discovered 3 huts near the head of a stream in the mountains. I went down and was immediately surrounded by 7 or 8 Chinese men. After a few minutes of sign language, I came to the conclusion that they were more curious than unfriendly. I went into one of their homes and they wanted me to take off my clothes as they were all soaking wet. I did this and they dried them out for me, but they also took everything out of my pockets. I walked back out on the porch and everything was gone off my belt but my water canteen. I slept in this small village all night. In the morning I tried to get my things back, but I did not have any luck. I had my identification card, web belt and canteen, leaving behind my watch, knife, gloves, silk scarf, first aid packet, billfold and pocket compass. One of the villagers walked most of the way down the trail with me passing many small settlements. Once I was stopped and searched for weapons but allowed to go on my way. That evening I came into a pretty good-sized village called Kenchi, where a garrison of soldiers was stationed. Although nobody there could speak English, they understood that I was an American. They took very good care of me, and the next day they took me down to the next garrison. We arrived there about 14 o'clock, but still there was no one who could talk English. I stayed there about an hour, and they gave me a guide to lead me toward the railroad. I drew pictures of trains and a track to make him understand that I wanted to go that way. A few miles down the trail, we came to a middle school where I found a teacher who could speak English. He told me it was only 20 li to Shangjiao. He got me a rickshaw to take me into the city, and that night I reached Shangjiao. I was taken to the military headquarters immediately. I told them about the other 4 crew members and gave them the location of where we bailed out, which was approximately 40 miles south of Shangjiao. That night I was put on the train and sent to Chusian, arriving there the next morning. Major Hilger, Captain Greening, Captain Jones, Lieutenant Bauer and their crews were already there. This was April 22nd. Lieutenant Youngblood arrived at Chusian on April 25th, and on April 28th the other 3 members of my crew came out of Shangjiao and were sent on to Chungking. On April 26th, Colonel Doolittle came in and told Captain Jones and myself to remain at Chusian to collect any information that we could and to gather all crews there. That night, May 3rd, having done all we could in Chusian and being able to account for all crews definitely except the 2 reported captured, we got on the train and started for Chungking. The next morning at 8 o'clock we arrived in Yantang and immediately got on a bus. We rode all that day and stayed that night in Ningtu. The next day we arrived in Tai Ho at about 4:30, where we were entertained by Daniel Yang, who had been in the United States for a short time. We left early the next morning around 2 o'clock, and arrived in Hengyang around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There was Lieutenant Watson and his crew. We stayed at a hostel in Hengyang, and they took very good care of us. On May 14th, the plane arrived and took us to Chungking. Here, most of the articles that had been taken from us were returned. On the whole, I found that the Chinese were very kind to us, and we received very good treatment in every case. Colonel Wong and the station master did everything in their power to gather information for us about various crews and to make us comfortable while we were at Chusian. The military district at Shangjiao also helped in this matter, giving us very good food and a wonderful banquet. The report above was made on May 14th, 1942, when I got to Chungking. It is interesting now to look back on that fateful day after more than 20 years have gone by. I see now that my report was not as complete as it might have been. On the day before we took off from the Hornet, the upper gun turret was out of commission due to electrical and hydraulic problems. Corporal Jordan and the other armament men worked on it, but their work was not completed before our unscheduled takeoff. My co-pilot, Lieutenant Lucian Youngblood, and I discussed changing our approach to Tokyo while we were flying toward the enemy coast. We thought it might be better not to follow the plane ahead of us on the theory that we would be less likely to run into fighters if we came into the target area on an entirely different heading. This change in course was made. Apparently we were spotted from some small islands as we neared Tokyo Bay, because as soon as we sighted land, 4 enemy Zeros appeared heading directly for us. Jordan shouted over the interphone that he could not fire the turret guns even in a fixed position. We were pretty much sitting ducks for 4 fighters with nothing but a .30 caliber gun in the nose. All they would have to do would be bounce us from any direction but head on, and we would not have a chance. I knew I had better do something, so I changed course immediately, and the Zeros changed with us giving a positive indication that they had seen us. Jordan then confirmed what we dreaded most. The 4 Zeros were peeling off at us, firing away. At the same time I spotted 8 to 10 more Zeros high above us and on an outbound course from Tokyo. By this time, of course, several explosives had already been dropped in the city by the previous planes. I made the decision that no bomber pilot ever wants to make, but sometimes must to save his plane and his crew from sure death. I ordered Sergeant Stevens to salvo the bombs, and I turned out to sea to attempt to outrun the fighters. After the bombs were gone and we headed southward at maximum speed, Jordan reported that the high planes had stayed high and were going on a steady course. I later figured that these airplanes were under some sort of fighter control, and the four were considered adequate to shoot us down. They never caught us, but it was only because they were not highly trained, or they certainly could have. Never did a fighter pilot have a better chance. Since the raid, people have asked me if I have any regrets. I can answer that this way. If I had had the experience that I gained in fighting the enemy later in several real air scraps following the raid, I would not have jettisoned those bombs, or at least my decision to do so would have been delayed. Although we were in serious trouble, I had obviously overestimated the capabilities of the enemy and could have at least retained the bombs to use on a target of opportunity. Lieutenant Holstrom had already been in action against the enemy before the Tokyo mission. On December 24, 1941, Holstrom and his crew, consisting of Lieutenant Ross R. Wilder, co-pilot, Private John O. Van Marter, radio operator, and Private First Class George R. Hammond, bombardier, had sunk an enemy submarine off the mouth of the Columbia River while their group was stationed at Pendleton, Oregon. Wilder later flew the Tokyo mission as co-pilot for Captain David M. Jones. All received the Air Medal and are credited with sinking the first enemy submarine in American waters in World War II. On the 17th of April, when they started fueling the airplanes, it was discovered that the bomb bay in my airplane was leaking. It was torn down, and an attempt was made to patch it. A fair job was done, and the tank was left empty all night to dry out. Early on the morning of the 18th, the bomb bay tank was fueled, and we started loading the bombs. All the airplanes were parked in place, and all the others had been loaded. The order for Army personnel to man their airplanes for takeoff was given just as we had finished loading the bombs, but we still had to fuel the crawlway tank and top off the wing tanks in my airplane. During the ensuing confusion, my engineer, Sergeant Joe Mansky, fueled the crawlway tank with the assistance of several Navy crewmen. He then climbed to the right wing of the airplane and topped off the two wing tanks. A Navy man was on the left wing topping the tanks there. As soon as this operation was complete, our crew entered the airplane. I immediately checked the gas gauge and noticed that the left rear tank registered about 30 gallons short. I called Manska and he got back on the wing to service the tank. A gas hose was passed up to him, but the gas, for some reason, was not turned on. By this time, the airplanes had started taking off, and about a dozen people were shouting instructions, so I told Mansky to get back in the airplane and started the engines. The takeoff was not difficult, and no trouble whatsoever was experienced in holding the airplane straight down the deck. As soon as we cleared the deck, I throttled back to the desired settings and made a circle to the right, passing back over the carrier at exactly 8:45. I then turned on course and climbed very slowly to about 1,900 feet, which was close to the base of the clouds. About 34 to 1 hour out, we passed a boat painted dark grey, which I believe was a tanker. Shortly after that, a twin-engine land plane came out of a cloud ahead of us and passed us on the right. I maintained course while it turned to avoid us. The enemy markings were plainly visible on it. It disappeared in the clouds behind us immediately. Soon after this, the weather cleared, and I remained at 1,500 feet until after we sighted the coastline of the enemy territory. As we approached the coast, I dropped down to the water and crossed the coastline at about 50 feet altitude. There were many small boats near the coast and a few steamers. I increased my speed to about 200 miles per hour, but after a short time, since we had encountered no opposition, reduced it again to 180. After about 10 minutes flying, we could not orient ourselves, and I believed that we were too far north. Accordingly, I turned to a more southerly course. After about 15 minutes more, we had not found Tokyo, and I decided to drop our explosives on the first suitable target and get on our way. Just then we came on a bay, and Jean McGurl, our navigator, discovered that it was the mouth of Tokyo Bay. I then turned north and approached Tokyo from the south. Since my gas was low and I had wasted time finding the area, and there was a multitude of targets visible as I crossed the bay, I decided to bomb along the bay in Sui Tokyo instead of turning east and flying around the city to get to my assigned area, which was just north of the business district of Tokyo. I informed my bombardier, Denver Truelove of this, and as I approached, the docks pulled up rather sharply to 1,200 feet. Truelove coached me over the interphone in my direction. The first explosive dropped at approximately 1350 ship time and made a direct hit on an oil storage tank. He let the second explosive go, and then I decided to turn left because the area there looked more profitable. I looked down in the town and could see the building, which I believe must have been a power plant, erupt in a great explosion. The next explosive was the incendiary, and just ahead we saw a large 1 or 2 story building which covered 2 or more blocks. It was easy to hit, and every one of the explosives in the cluster hit on the roof of this plant. By this time my speed had increased considerably due to the urge given us by intense AA fire, and the fourth explosive, which was aimed at another large building, hit a little over and probably only damaged one corner of said building. At the instant of release, I again descended to minimum altitude and took up my course to the south for withdrawal. I proceeded as planned, and as soon as I reached the water again reduced power. We flew south until we passed the small islands, and then took up a course to the southern tip of Honshu Island. I flew at about 1,000 feet during this stretch. During this time we saw a few small boats, and about 200 miles from Yakushima Island we sighted 3 destroyers steaming NE. We avoided them. We passed the southern tip of the enemy territory about 50 minutes ahead of our estimated time of arrival, and took up a course which would put us on the 29th parallel just off the coast of China. As we passed into the China Sea, the weather became increasingly worse. I remained contact. About 1/2 hour ahead of our estimated time of arrival, we sighted 2 small islands and decided we were far enough south to be out of occupied territory. I stayed low until we saw the coastline, and since it was impossible to remain, contact pulled up into the clouds. I climbed at about 500 feet per minute, and only increased my revolutions per minute to 1,600. At 5,500 feet, we broke out between layers. By this time, it was completely dark and raining hard. It was becoming more and more evident that the chances of a safe landing were very slim. I informed the crew of our situation and decided to remain on course and to jump out as close to Chusian as possible. I continued past our estimated time of arrival at Chuchao for 15 minutes in hopes of finding a break. This proved futile, so I turned 180 degrees and flew back until I found a small hole in the clouds. We put out a landing flare which showed us that an attempted landing would be impossible. We then prepared to abandon ship. Manska and Truelove went out almost together, followed by McGirl. The co-pilot, Hoss Wilder, then went to the navigator's well and put on his gun belt. The airplane was on autopilot, so I climbed back in the navigator's compartment with Wilder. I put on my gun belt and wrapped the carrying strap of my musette bag around my left arm. Wilder eased himself down through the escape hatch and dropped out. I turned and started to go back into the cockpit to retard the throttle, but my foot slipped, and since it was rather lonely in the airplane, I gave up the idea and let myself out of the escape hatch. I landed on the side of a hill and was uninjured. As soon as I got my breath, I cut the shroud lines of the chute and climbed to the top of the hill. I draped the chute over a small tree and spent the night under it. At daybreak, I started walking. I soon found some natives, and after drawing a picture of a railroad train, finally got a general direction in which to walk. I reached the Shetsung station, 18 miles east of Yushan, about 11, where I found Wilder. The station master could write a little English, and we conveyed to him our desire to go to Chusian. He called Yushan on the phone, and a train came out and picked us up. When we reached Yushan, a large crowd was assembled. We were given a royal reception. How they knew about us and our mission I do not know, but certainly all the people knew about the great deed of the brave American heroes. We were taken to the air station at Yushan, where they washed our feet, cleaned up our clothes, fed us, and put us to bed. About 17 o'clock, we started for Chusian in a station wagon, and arrived there about 17:30. Upon arrival, I found the rest of my crew all okay. The following day, the 20th, reports started coming in concerning the position of various crews, and that night 4 complete crews came in. After about 20 members had assembled, Major Jack Hilger sent them to Hengyang under command of Captain Ross Greening. Colonel Doolittle came in on the 26th and left with all the crew members except myself and Lieutenant Ozuk the following day. I left Chusian on the evening of the 3rd with 12 other crew members. We got on the bus the next morning at Yingtang. We stayed that night at Ningtu. The following day we travelled to Tai Ho and after a few hours rest started for Hengyang, arriving there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on May 6th. We remained there until May 14th when an airplane picked us up and transported us to Chungking. During our mission briefing, we were given large target maps, approximately 2.5 feet square. These maps were incredibly detailed, showing every highway, railroad track, building, and even dwelling houses around our targets. Each map covered only a small area but contained a target number and everything we needed to know about the surroundings. We also had smaller scale maps to navigate into Tokyo, plus backup maps of alternate targets in case we couldn't reach our primary objective. Our orders were crystal clear. We were definitely told not to bomb non-military objectives. When we first learned we were going to bomb Tokyo, there was quite a bit of excitement among the crews. In fact, we even cut a deck of cards to see who would get to bomb the Imperial Palace. We all wanted that target. The truth was, none of us had any love for the enemy, and we figured the Emperor was at the bottom of the whole war, so we wanted to get at the source of it all. But Colonel Doolittle heard about our card game and our discussion. He told us definitively to leave the Imperial Palace alone and to bomb only military objectives. We spent most of every day in briefings about military targets. My crew was assigned the steel mills in the northeastern portion of Tokyo, around the edge of the bay. The flight itself began with 3 ships flying in wide formation until we sighted the islands. Once we spotted land, we pulled into close formation and flew at approximately 100 feet above the water. About 42 minutes after leaving the Hornet, we passed 1 enemy patrol plane, but after we came in over the islands, we sighted 6 more enemy planes flying at about 10,000 feet. Fortunately, they never saw us. When we reached Tokyo, we climbed to 1,500 feet for our bombing run. The anti-aircraft fire was quite intense. They had our elevation figured out, but couldn't match our speed. As we approached the target, we pulled our formation into a tight echelon. Captain Jones was in the lead, Lieutenant Lawson was second, and our ship was third. We were targeting a row of steel mills that was approximately 600 feet wide and 2,000 feet long. We had arranged before leaving the Hornet that Captain Jones would give us a signal, and we would alternate our bomb drops to scatter them throughout the target area. I watched 3 or 4 of the first explosions and the last 3. We dropped our bombs and still had 1 left, so we had to make a second run while taking heavy anti-aircraft fire meant for the lead ship. The machine guns on my plane were never fired during the entire mission, not from the time we left the Hornet until we crashed. The crash itself was devastating. Both motors cut out almost simultaneously, though the left one failed first. The left wing hit the water first and was severed right up close to the fuselage. As the fuselage hit, it split open all the way to the bottom. The pilot was thrown from his chair right through the windshield. The gunner was still in his turret when the plane went down. Later he thought he was about 20 fathoms deep before he finally got out. The bombardier Dieter was in the tunnel coming down to the navigator's well when we crashed. Fitzmaurice was our gunner. We all managed to get out of the plane and retrieved the life raft, but it wouldn't work properly. Both the bombardier and gunner were badly beaten up from the crash. Only 3 of us, Hallmark, Meader, and myself, actually made it to the coast. Fitzmaurice and Dieter were still alive when they got out of the plane, but we tried to stay together and swim to shore in terrible conditions. It was raining, the ocean was rough and very dark, and we eventually got separated. The next morning, when the 3 of us survivors got together, we went back to look for them and found their bodies on the shore. They had been so badly injured in the crash that they couldn't survive. We couldn't save anything from the aircraft except the clothing we were wearing. Hallmark had some lacerations on his leg, and Meader and I had a few cuts, but we were in better shape than the others. After we got together, we found a small Chinese guerrilla outfit garrisoned nearby. We stayed with them for about 3 days, trying to find a way over the mountain passes, but the enemy had guards and sentries on all of them. We couldn't make it through. We were trying to get some sampans rigged up to escape down the coast when the enemy apparently heard we were there. About 300 enemy soldiers marched in and searched the entire place until they found us. Hallmark and Meader were in bad shape. They could barely walk and were pretty badly crippled up. We were captured on April 21st. The enemy loaded us into chairs and took us to their garrison, then transferred us by boat to Shanghai. During the boat trip, the 3 of us were kept in one small room. We were handcuffed and tied by our elbows so tightly it cut off circulation. While on the boat, our arms weren't tied, but we remained handcuffed, and at night they cuffed our legs together. The journey took about 4 days from where we were captured until we reached Shanghai. They took us to the airport, where we arrived around 4 o'clock in the evening. We were put in individual cells, and then I was taken out for questioning. They wanted to know where I had been, where I came from, and what I was doing in China. I gave them only my name, rank, and serial number. When I wouldn't tell them anything else, they began the torture. They kicked me and slapped me severely around the face and head. The kicks to my shins were so hard I still had scars years later. Then they gave me what they called the water cure. They put me on my back on the floor with my arms and legs stretched out, one guard holding each limb. They wrapped a towel around my face and poured water on it until I was almost unconscious from drowning. Then they'd let up just enough for me to catch my breath before starting again. This continued for about 20 minutes, and I felt like I was constantly gasping between life and death. The torture continued with a large bamboo pole about 3 inches in diameter placed directly behind my knees. They made me squat on the floor while one guard held each of my arms. Another guard placed his foot on my thigh and jumped up and down, causing severe pain in my knees. It felt like my joints were coming apart, but after about 5 minutes my knees went numb. This torture lasted 15 to 20 minutes. Later I learned that the other members of my crew received similar treatment. Hallmark told me they put him on a stretcher and stretched him out until he felt like his limbs were coming apart. As the day ended, it was almost sundown when they made their final threat. They said if I wouldn't talk, they would execute me. I was blindfolded and taken out. The pain in my legs was so severe I could hardly walk, so one guard held me under each arm as we marched about 300 or 400 feet down a gravel path. I could hear different groups of enemy soldiers drilling in the area. After marching 400 feet, we stopped. I heard a squad march up and stop beside us. I could hear rifle butts hit the ground and thought this was my execution. But after a conference between the officers and whoever was commanding the squad, the interpreter came back with chilling words. "We are knights of the Bushido of the Order of the Rising Sun. We do not execute at sundown, we execute at sunrise." I was taken back to my cell, and the interpreter told me that unless I decided to talk by morning, I would be executed at sunrise. We were the 7th plane to take off the carrier at approximately 9 o'clock. From the time we left the ship until we got to Tokyo, there were 2 of our planes ahead of us, but we never got close enough to see who they were. We saw a freighter off to our right and a lot of small boats as we sped in just off the wave tops. As we passed over the coast, people on the beach looked up and waved at us. People riding bicycles or walking along the roads stopped whatever they were doing and watched us go by. From the way they acted, it seemed as though no enemy planes ever flew that low. We were apparently too far north of our course, because after going inland a little way, Lieutenant Lawson turned left and we flew parallel to the coast. About halfway down the coast toward Tokyo, while zigzagging among the mountains, we saw 6 pursuits flying approximately 5,000 feet above us and going in the exact opposite direction from which we had come. 2 of them broke formation, but I do not think they saw us, or I am sure they would have come after us. I had tested my guns just before reaching the coast, but found I could only operate the turret when the emergency switch was on in the pilot's compartment. This meant the turret was operating directly from the battery, the 24-volt generator being out before we took off. While flying over the bay just before reaching Tokyo, we saw 4 or 5 barrage balloons off to our left, but they were not in our way. Just before we reached our target, which was a large factory on the waterfront, we climbed to 1,500 feet. When we leveled off, ack began bursting on all sides of us. We dropped all 4 explosives. One of them had the enemy medals attached, and I think I saw the first one explode. There was a large puff of black smoke coming up from the thickly congested building area. The ack got awfully close just as we dropped the last one bursting just off the right wing. I could see the battery that fired that one off to our right. Lieutenant Lawson must have seen it too, because he went into a steep dive to the left, and we left Tokyo going 300 miles per hour. After leaving Tokyo, we saw one of our planes ahead of us until we turned west and passed the southern tip of the enemy territory. When we passed out of sight of land over the China Sea, I crawled up over the bomb bay to the navigator's compartment, and we talked over the experience we had just had in actual combat. We checked our gas and decided we had enough to reach the China coast. When we finally did, at about 9 p.m. it was getting dark. I had climbed back to the rear turret again just in case we should have some unexpected friends waiting for us. Lawson found a bay after we reached the coast and circled it about 3 times trying to find a flat beach to land on. Lawson told us to remove our parachutes and said he was going to try a water landing, so I sat next to the turret tank ready to release the life raft after we ditched. We hit the water with an extremely hard jolt, and I was knocked out cold. When I came to about 5 minutes later, I saw the water gushing in through the top of the turret, which I thought was the rear escape hatch. Still dazed, I pulled the strings to inflate my Mae West and tried to go out through the opening, but I could not make it. I finally figured out that the plane was upside down, so I found the rear escape hatch and got out there. I crawled up along the belly of the plane toward the nose and found that it was badly smashed. Just at that time, Lieutenant McClure called to me from the beach about 100 yards away. The others were there too. I saw to them and learned what had happened. Lieutenant Lawson had changed his mind and tried to make a wheels down landing on the beach, but because of the rain hitting on the windshield and it being nearly dark, he had misjudged the distance and we hit just off the beach in about 6 feet of water, doing about 140 miles per hour. I was lucky. The other 4 crew members up in front of the plane were all thrown out when we hit. The pilot, co-pilot, and navigator were thrown up through the top of the cockpit and not straight forward. The bombardier, Lieutenant Bob Clever, was in the nose when we crashed, and he was thrown through the plexiglass head first. The injuries he received were cuts around both eyes, and the top of his head was so badly skinned that half his hair was gone, but, strangely, there were no deep cuts in his head. His hips and back were sprained, so that he was unable to stand up and walk. All he could do was crawl on his hands and knees. His eyes were soon swollen shut and he could not see. His face was severely injured, but I thought it would be better to leave it that way because of what Dr. White had told us about infections. I knew infection would set in soon enough if we could not reach help. Besides, I had my hands full with the other members of the crew. Lieutenant Lawson was, by far, the most seriously injured. The plane had landed with such force that both the pilot's and co-pilot's seats and armor plate had been uprooted and literally exploded out of the plane with them sitting in their seats. His worst injury was a long, deep gash just above his left knee. He had another short, deep cut on his left shin that left the bone exposed. His foot below the ankle was so badly bruised that it turned black within a few hours. He also had a deep gash on his left arm between elbow and shoulder. He had a few cuts on the top of his head and chin. 8 or 9 of his front teeth were knocked out so that he was unable to bite or chew anything. He was so weak from loss of blood that I was afraid he would die if we did not reach a hospital. He tried to sleep, but it was almost impossible because he was in such intense pain. He was very good about it, though, and did not complain very much. After I had bandaged his injuries that first night, I left them as they were and did not try to wash them out or anything. Doctor's lectures had really made an impression on me, and I knew he was right. Lieutenant Davenport, the co-pilot, received severe cuts on his right leg between knee and ankle. He walked a little just after the crash, but not afterward. Lieutenant McClure, the navigator, only received a few scratches on his right foot in the way of cuts, these later being infected. The serious injury he had was in his shoulders. He said when we crashed that he was crouching between the pilot's and co-pilot's seats and hit the armor plate with both shoulders as he went out. His shoulders were swollen so badly clear down to his elbows that he could hardly move his hands. He was unable to lie down at all and had to try to sleep sitting up. Both Lawson and Davenport said they were still fastened in their seats when they came to underwater. With their injuries, it is a wonder they were not drowned. They both were able to unfasten their safety belts and float to the top, then swam or were washed ashore. It was only by the hand of God that any of us got out of there alive, let alone all of us. Luckily, out of all these injuries, there were no bones broken except Lawson losing those teeth. My injuries were all minor. I had a slight gash on the top of my head. If I had not had my flying helmet on, it would have been much worse. My back was badly bruised and I had a few small cuts which later became infected, but I was in the best shape to take care of the others. By the time I had reached the beach after Lieutenant McClure had called to me, there were some Chinese fishermen there who had come down from a small village. We could tell almost immediately that they were friendly. The first thing they wanted to know by sign language was whether there were any more than 5 of us in the plane. When they found out there were no more, they helped us to one of their huts, which was about a half-mile away. When we reached the hut, I bandaged everybody's wounds as best I could. I was the only one to get out of the plane with a gun belt on, so I used the bandage in my first air packet for the large wound on Lawson's knee. I used my handkerchief on the cut on his arm. For his other wounds and the wounds on Davenport and Clever, I had to use old, dirty rags that the fishermen gave us. I had no choice if I were going to stop their bleeding. Later that night, I took a lantern and went out to try to get a large first aid kit out of the tail of the plane, but it was impossible since the tide had come in and the plane was now under water. Early the next morning, I went out to the plane to get the first aid kit and morphine, but could not find either. During the night, the plane had washed up on the beach when the tide came in, but the engines which had torn loose when we crashed were still out in the water. The nose of the plane was a mangled mess clear back to the bomb bay. If the 4 men in the nose had not been thrown out, they would never have gotten out of there alive. If I had been sitting in the turret, I would never have gotten out alive either. While I was looking at the plane and searching for things we could use, I spotted an enemy gunboat out in the bay. Possibly I could have burned what was left of the plane because there was a little gasoline running out of one of the tanks, but I did not think of that at the time. All I was thinking of was trying to find the first aid kit or morphine for the others and getting out of there before the enemy came. I learned that the name of the place where we crashed was Nantian, from a Chinese guerrilla who could speak a little English and had come with a group of them at the request of the fishermen. We told him we wanted to get to a hospital as soon as possible. That afternoon we left there with the 4 wounded, wrapped in blankets and carried on stretchers by coolies. All the time Lawson was in terrific pain from the wound in his leg. We had to climb up and over a high hill to get to the other side of the island. By late afternoon we got to a riverboat and headed for the mainland. We were on the riverboat from about 6 p.m. April 19th until about 3 p.m. April 20th. There was a covering over the middle of the boat which kept us dry while it was raining, which seemed like all the time. I was kept busy going from one to the other, trying to make them as comfortable as possible. But they would soon get tired lying in one position, so I would help them move into another. I helped them as much as possible, but there really was not much I could do for them. About midnight, we stopped at one of the guerrilla hideouts to get something to eat. I went up to the house with them and got a bowl of what looked like noodle soup. I was pretty darned hungry, but whatever was in that bowl, I just could not swallow it. They gave me some for the rest of the fellows in the boat, but it only added to their misery. We did not have any drinking water left by this time, and I sure did not want to drink any of the dirty water from the streams or the Chinese wells, so I set my canteen cup to catch rainwater. Lawson was wanting water all the time because his throat was so dry from his mouth injury where all his teeth had been knocked out. I did not think that night would ever end. I had understood the guerrilla to say that it would only take 2 hours, but it took almost 24. When we finally put into shore, we were taken about 5 miles inland to a village called Haiyu, where 2 Chinese doctors and a nurse gave us our first medical aid. I sent a telegram to Colonel Doolittle at Chungking telling him of our condition. The next day, after helping us as much as they could with the few medical supplies they had, they gave us a royal send-off with a band and everything. We then travelled 40 miles by sedan chair to Linhai, where there was a hospital. A Chinese doctor and his son, with the aid of missionaries from the China Inland Mission, immediately took care of the injured. On April 23rd, I got a telegram from Lieutenant Travis Hoover saying that all of his crew was okay. On the morning of the 24th, Lieutenant Don Smith and his crew arrived. They had heard of our predicament, and Dr. White knew he had to get to us as soon as possible. He took charge of the wounded from then on. The first thing he did was give Lawson a blood transfusion. He got blood from Lieutenant Griffith R. William, Smith's co-pilot, and had to use syringes to do it. Since I was unhurt and could not help any more with the wounded, I left Linhai with Smith's crew on the morning of the 27th by sedan chair and travelled this way for 3 days. On the 4th, we started out in rickshaws, and at 11 that morning we came to a highway where, much to our surprise, there was a 1938 Dodge sedan and a 1939 Ford sedan waiting for us. We went to Kinwa in these cars, and from there to Chusian by train. At Chusian were Hoover's crew, Captain Jones, and Lieutenants Ozuk and Holstrom. There I learned that Factor had been dead. Reverend John M. Birch, a missionary there, gave a funeral service for him in the air raid shelter the Sunday we were there, although the grave was not yet ready. Factor was a good friend of mine, and I certainly thought it was considerate of Reverend Birch to give that funeral service. I gave Birch as much information about Factor as I could, but I did not know his exact age or his hometown in Iowa. We stayed at Chusian for several days, and were helped considerably by a Mr. Liu, who had helped Hoover and his crew stay out of the hands of the enemy. We had an air raid almost every day and always went to a bomb shelter in a hill nearby. Apparently the enemy were out looking for us and were going to retaliate against the Chinese for helping us. We left Chuzian on May 3rd and travelled by ancient bus for 3 days to Hengyang, where we stayed until we were flown out to Chongqing. I was worried all the time about the rest of my crew back in Linhai and hoped they were okay. I was the lucky one. They had not only been badly injured but now were directly in the path of the advancing enemy army. "Make sure those throttles do not slip back," York said as he watched the Navy flagman on the Hornet's pitching deck arm up and ready to give the "let her go" signal, which sent each B-25 in its turn out across the grey North Pacific run to Tokyo and neighbouring towns. Our ship shuddered under the strain of both throttles being wide open. Flaps were full down, controls all the way back in our laps. Just at a point in the carrier's antics known to him alone, the flagman, that Navy master of judgment, let his arms drop the signal to roll. York released his brakes, and 2242 began to roll, left wheel on the white line, down the deck of the carrier, slowly at first. My God, how slowly. Then faster, faster, the island of the carrier was lost from sight as it passed a bare 8 feet away from our right wing tip, and then, like a big living thing, our plane seemed to leap into the air just as the deck of the ship disappeared under us and was replaced by the frothing sea. "Now ease up a little on the controls, not too much, just enough to let her nose drop and pick up flying speed. Wheels up. Now she is levelling out nicely. Airspeed up within safe limits. Now start taking off flaps, throttles back to save that precious gasoline." We adjusted our power settings and checked our compass, and then we breathed again. There we were, off on a mission, being a member of which was more than any of us had ever dared hope for. The bombing of Tokyo. We were number 8 to get off the carrier, and somehow our own takeoff did not give me the thrill, actually doing it, that watching the 7 ships take off ahead of us did, or that looking back on it now does. It is difficult to recapture now the feelings or mixture of feelings we had as we settled down for our 780-mile run into the enemy territory. I say we're because I think the same feelings were surging through all of us. In my mind I removed for a moment all cause and reason from our situation and, looking at the instrument panel, the controls, the wings and the engines, and closing out the what and why of the thing, it seemed to me like any of the hundreds of times I had flown in a B-25. Like any routine or cross-country flight back in the States. But looking down and out at the limitless expanse of water, reality was not long in coming to the front. Nor did recalling those eggs in our bomb bay, live ammunition, lots of it, in our guns, remind us of any routine cross-country flight back home. I thought about the stack of razor blades, candy, and cartons of cigarettes I had purchased aboard the Hornet. And then I laughed at myself for buying such things as if I would be gone a year, when actually here we were on our final mission, and it would be over that same day. And we would be starting back home, probably, in a few days. Herndon gave us a corrected heading to fly to compensate for a pretty strong wind from our right front quarter, as we checked and rechecked power and propeller settings against airspeed. Everything seemed to be running like clockwork. It was too early to check gas consumption, because our auxiliary tanks had no gauges in them. Pole was operating the rear turret and fired a few bursts to be sure his guns were working. Laban was busy in the navigator's compartment checking the generators and rearranging our baggage load. Take-O Fight 55. I wrote in the Form 1. Conversations were short and to the point. Every man was going over again in his mind each item for which he knew he was responsible. Of course, little black thoughts like an engine going out over that expanse of salt water and the possibility of a reception committee of enemy zeros crept forward often enough to keep our minds well occupied with imaginary forced landings and combat tactics. The sun was now fast burning away the low overcast which had prevailed during the early morning hours, and in its place was a clear blue sky broken only by the not-too-sharp line where it met the shore north, south, east, and west. West, that was the only direction that mattered then, though. Pole called a little sooner than we expected, to tell us he had just dumped the last tin of gasoline into the auxiliary tail tank. York told him to be sure not to throw any of the tins away until we were much closer to the enemy territory, and then to throw them out all in one bunch. This meant less chance of the cans being a telltale mark of our path of flight. There must be no clue as to our method and place of departure, the whereabouts of Shangri-La. As we reset the throttles and propitch controls to compensate for decrease in weight of gas consumed, the engines droned evenly on, and the scenery remained unchanged. It reminded you of standing stationary on a treadmill, with a watery flow passing underneath. Twice we spotted objects on the horizon ahead that might have been submarines, fishing craft, or even small ships out patrolling. We avoided these partly because of the probability of their radioing their base to expect us, and partly because of the danger of anti-aircraft fire. It was a temptation not to go over and see if the ship might be a sub, and lay an egg on it, but our bombs were earmarked for bigger and more important things, and little attention was paid to these small craft. At 10:30 the sky was clear and blue. Herndon gave us another correction for wind, but it remained a headwind and continued from our right quarter. Where were the clouds we had hoped for to lend us the protection so vital to daylight raiding? Well, we had a couple of hours to go, and probably there would be clouds by then. As our gasoline was used up, we changed our power settings to compensate for the decrease in weight being carried. At about 11 o'clock we had been flying long enough to have a fairly definite check on the amount of gasoline we were burning. I flew while York did some figuring on paper. "Hey Bob, take a look at this. Am I screwy, or are we burning this much gas?" His figures showed we were burning more gas than we should have been at those power and RPM settings. York's figures were right. Maybe the gauge was inaccurate and would give the same reading after more time. Maybe we had developed a gas leak, letting pure gasoline spill into the Pacific Ocean. We should have flown out our reserve turret tank and part of our bomb bay tank by the time we hit the enemy territory. But we were more than an hour from the enemy territory and had been on our bomb bay tank then for quite some time. Maybe, but you can let your imagination run rampant at a time like that. Ski, if that is right, we are not going to get near the Chinese coast. Herndon, busy in the nose with his charts and sextant, came into the pilot's compartment now. He personally checked the reading on the bomb bay tank. Yes, there was no mistaking it. We were burning a lot of gasoline, besides landing on enemy territory, which, of course, was out of the question. We had one alternative other than taking our originally planned course south around the lower end of the enemy territory and then west across the China Sea. That was striking out across the North Sea to Soviet territory, to our allies, the Russians, who might or might not be depended upon to give us gas so we could continue to China, who might or might not recognize us as friendly when and if we approached their probably well-fortified eastern coast. "Have you got a course from Tokyo to Russia plotted, Herndon?" asked York, voicing what we were all thinking. "Yes, I have plotted all possibilities. Do you want it now?" Herndon had made Tokyo look like a rising sun, his course lines representing sun rays emitting from the capital. "No, I do not want it now. I guess you guys remember Doolittle did not exactly issue a direct order not to go to Russia, but he made it plenty obvious that it was not a good idea. Doolittle had told us more than once that Stalin had been asked to cooperate on this mission and to allow us to fly to one of his eastern airdromes for fuel. This would have made the mission. The 600-mile run from Tokyo across the sea would have enabled each ship to expend a little extra gas for the actual bombing and for outrunning any pursuers. It would have made returning via the Alaskan route a cinch within a few days after the raid. It would have assured a safe landing for those 16 B-25s which so dependably carried each crew over the miles of Pacific Ocean, and it would have meant saving the lives of those boys who afterward fell into enemy hands or who were dead bailing out or crash landing. And it would have broken the ice on getting Uncle Joe to open his eastern seaboard for Allied use against the enemy. But Stalin had refused. The enemy territory and Russia were ostensibly at peace. Border skirmishes and disagreements about fishing rights kept it from being an actual peace. Germany was keeping the Soviets well occupied in the West, though, and just now Joseph Stalin did not feel he could afford to act as a shelter for Allied airplanes on so unbelievable a mission as bombing Tokyo. And another thing. What if the enemy demanded that the Russians turn us over to them? Would they feel obligated to do so? Would they do it in order to wash their hands of the whole affair? Would it have such far-reaching repercussions as to strengthen or weaken the hands of trust existing between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? Maybe there would be nothing to it. Maybe several ships would turn to them as an only out. They would probably give us gas and we would be on our way across occupied Korea and China tomorrow morning, York said. We hope, I answered. A sudden jolt as York jerked the stick back to miss a startled seagull brought all our eyes to the front. Seagulls that meant land was not so far now. It was nearly noon, and not a cloud appeared in the sky in any direction. We will check the gas again as we are approaching the island before we make our decision to head toward Russia or not, Ski said. It seemed as if we had been flying for a week, checkpoints are few and far between on an ocean. We wondered if the 8 ships behind us had gotten off the carrier okay. We wondered how strong enemy resistance would be. Did you ever have that feeling of wishing you could see what you would be doing in 12 hours or 24 hours, say, tomorrow at this same time next week, next month, next year? That flashed through my mind. I wondered what Justine was doing at that minute. Gee, I wanted to be with her when the baby came. How we had wanted a baby, since the day we were married over 3 years ago. And is not that life for you, to have one on the way when the world exploded that December 7th? Ski was in the same boat on that score as I, although they were not positive when he left the States. The same twist of fate was at work there that seemed to be working for us now, it occurred to me. Getting off that morning early instead of having the advantage of a day's run at top carrier speed to put us nearer the target, and clear skies over a sea where clouds are so usual. And something making the gas go through our carburetor like water through a sieve. I do not know who saw the speck of land appear on the horizon first, but there it was, unmistakable and growing. Let us take a final check on that bomb bay gauge, I said, starting to get out of my seat, but Sergeant Laban was already up on top of the bomb bay tank. The rubber extra tank, which fitted on the top of the regular bomb bay, was long since collapsed and rolled up ready to be dumped out with the cans. Laban's reading on the gas gauge was pretty discouraging. We would not get closer than 300 miles to the Chinese coast. York called Pole and had him throw out the empty cans that had contained our reserve gas, and the collapsible rubber tank on top of the bomb bay followed. It did not matter now. The enemy, finding them out there, would not know from where we had come. By the time Pole answered over the interphone system that the cans and rubber tank had been tossed clear and that he was again taking up his battle station in the rear turret, land was plainly visible. It stretched like any seacoast to the right and left out of sight. It was about 10 minutes before noon then. Goodness, that sure looks like a carrier up ahead there, said York. And sure enough, we could see what appeared to be a carrier paralleling the coast directly ahead of us. A carrier, they are dynamite at a time like that. What a reception we would be in for. We abruptly changed our course to the left to avoid her. But to our relief, as we approached a little nearer, we could see it was a freighter, pretty heavily loaded, ploughing slowly south along the coast. We stayed out of her gun range and headed directly for the beach, now very plain in front of us. Where is Mount Fujiyama? I said to Ski. I had seen lots of laundry calendars, and I thought old Fujiyama, snow-covered and pink, would be looming up to meet us long before now, but only a rugged mountainous skyline began appearing inland. I must admit I was plenty tense about that time. I think we all were. We could see the breakers on the beach now, and in a matter of minutes we would not only be over dry land again, but enemy dry land. Ski talked to each man to make sure each was in his assigned combat position, and the interphone was working. Everything was in order. Herndon called from his navigator's seat in the glass-encased nose. Course from Tokyo to Vladivostok, 300 degrees. I cannot get over that gas consumption. Can you figure it out? Said Ski. No, unless we have got a gas leak, and there is no evidence of that. We sure must be burning a rich mixture, though. I guess Russia is our only out, then. I sure wish we could let them know we are coming, so they will know who we are when and if we get there. I said, aware of the impossibility of letting them know. Now we were approaching the sandy beach. There seemed to be a part fenced off directly ahead of us. It looked as if there were a group of about 200 people within the enclosure. In one corner away from the water, a tower about 50 feet high was erected, supporting a little watch platform with a white roof. We zoomed right over the heads of the people on the beach, and not very far from the watchman's cage itself. The people waved frantically, and many of them jumped up and down. At that speed it was only a glimpse, really, but I would swear those faces were the faces of white men, not Orientals. We both remarked about this, and later we all, except Pole, who could not see from his seat in the rear of the plane, spoke of it. Could they have been American and British prisoners? Looking back now, it seems they were unusually excited. Lord, how I would like to think they were Americans and British who looked up from their sordid surroundings and saw planes carrying the American emblem painted boldly on their wings. Maybe a ray of hope pierced their black existences for that brief moment. I hope so. The interphone broke our radio silence with a garble of words from Herndon in the nose, giving us course directions, and Pole in the tail pointing out a formation of 9 enemy planes high on our right, going in the opposite direction. Apparently they never saw us. They were in view such a short time and at such a distance that it was difficult to tell what kind of ships they were. They might have been trainers or fighters. Now we were in a more thickly populated area. A single tall radio-transmitting pole rose ahead of us. "There is the radio station Joke right over there," came over the interphone from Herndon. We had no time to investigate that, though. Suddenly, from our right came a single small airplane. He was turning so that as he completed his turn, we were well ahead of him. Pole later told us we were well lined up on him with the rear guns, but he was lost behind us before he ever got into range for firing. Suddenly, Ski pulled up to about 1,500 feet. There was our target directly on our nose. It was a big factory installation with 4 puffing stacks, at least a 3-story structure with a fair-sized river alongside and several railroad tracks entering its immediate area. "Open your bomb bay doors, Herndon." And then to me, "Goodness. That would be a fine thing at a time like this to forget to open your bomb bay doors." The plane gave its characteristic shudder as the bomb bay doors underneath opened. "PD!" came the familiar voice from the nose. Ski began ruddering the ship from right to left, keeping the needle on 0. 1,500 feet was indicated on our altimeter, and our airspeed was well above 200 miles an hour now. It looked good to see that speed after the morning hours of riding along at a sluggish 165 to 170 indicated. The target disappeared under our nose. "Bombs away!" A pause, and then bomb bay doors closed. Just as a slight jolt told us the eggs had landed, the repercussion making the ship rock. We lost our altitude, and the airspeed climbed up yet higher as we made a turn to the right, then left, then right, searching the skies for pursuers.